Brian, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Sure. I live in Statesboro, Georgia. I work full time for Southern Evangelical Seminary, part time for Apologia, which is a service for homeschoolers, which we teach classes for them. Reserve Air Force chaplain, 3 kids. Enjoy playing guitar, golf once upon a time, backyard astronomy, that kind of thing. So, yeah.
Cool. I'm an atheist, by which I mean I believe that natural facts explain everything about the world we need to know, and that it's better explained by naturalism than theism. Um, Today, I believe we're talking about the problem of evil. So, could you tell me some more about your position on the problem of evil and what you believe the correct take on it is?
Okay. Well, first, I appreciate your definition of atheism, that it's not the lack of belief thing, from what I can tell with what you're saying. So I said when I was getting my PhD that I did not want to study the problem of evil because everyone and their dog fleas were writing on the problem of evil. So I just didn't want to do that. So I said I didn't want to debate new atheists or do the problem of evil. And in 2019, I ended up debating a new atheist on the problem of evil, which was fun, and I'm glad I did it. But so the reason I didn't want to get involved in it is because I just thought everyone was doing it. So why get involved in something that everyone, I want to do something different. But I read a little bit on it from a different take, and I appreciate that take. It's by Brian Davies, who gets his take, I think, from Herbert McCabe. They're both Thomistic. Now, I'm a Protestant, but we have a lot of sympathy for Catholic philosophers and philosophy in general, even with people like Aristotle. So um, I critique both atheists and theists. I think a lot of theists go in the wrong direction with this problem as well, because a lot of theists want to say, okay, let's look at evil and try to fit God into the context of evil. And I think that's wrong. I think that theists give too much ground on that problem to the atheists. So I think that if we have good arguments for God's existence, and if we're trying to argue that God is a necessary being, if we're successful and those arguments are sound, then evil could not be an argument against God's existence, even in principle. So we need to be clear, I think, on what evil is, what the nature of evil is, which oftentimes is not discussed very well, and the nature of God. And a lot of theists, this is where I really critique the theists a lot, is that they think that God or take God to be a being among other beings, or very univocal, or the same, or just like humans. So when we say, for example, that God has knowledge, or God has power, or God is good, a lot of theists take God is good and Brian is good to be pretty much the same thing, and I just reject that. So we come at the problem of evil, I think, from a different context or different angle. So I don't know if you want to go more in depth, or we're going to hash that out more along the talk, or what.
Well, so I like the logical problem of evil. I prefer that to the
Okay.
evidential. But the argument goes something like there is unnecessarily gratuitous suffering in the world. And because there is gratuitous suffering that God could have created the world without, therefore God must not be perfectly good, or something along those
All right.
lines. And what would be your take on that presentation in what you just described? How would you pursue or engage with that criticism based on what you just said about how you approach it?
Okay. So just from the point of view from what I just brought up, there's a weird way that I would agree. So for my debate with Michael Shermerek in 2019, which was really fun, I enjoyed that a lot. I started debating and interacting more with James Sturba, who has a good book out called "Is a Good God Logically Possible?" He's a Notre Dame philosopher. We've done some projects together. We still are. And he's trying to shore up the logical problem that he thinks was going on between Mackey and Plantinga. So we've been going on about that for the last couple of years. But I think that the main issue I would have with the problem would be that, well, there's a few things, but one would just, the main thing would be that, well, if we say God is not perfectly good, then if I was having a one-on-one with somebody, I would ask them what they think good means. I'm probably going to agree with the person if they mean good in a moral sense, because what I've been trying to argue for in my position along the lines of Davies, who is also along the lines of Herbert McCabe, is that while God is good, and I can hash that out more for you if you want, he's not a moral being like human beings are. And the moral evil, or the problem of evil, normally takes God to be have to be justified in some sense. And I'm just going to reject that and say that God is not the kind of being to have anything to be justified, kind of like the story of Job. We say we have Job undergoing horrible, horrendous evils at the beginning of the book, and at the tail end of the book, God doesn't give a theodicy or a defense. He just says, I'm God and you're not. And so I think the main difference in my position and others, even among theists, is I don't take God as a being that has to be justified, because he's not a moral kind of being like we are. I think he transcends the moral categories in the same kind of sense that he transcends time and space and physicality. Now, we could always go back to, you mentioned the gratuitous evil. We could always, you don't know what gratuitous means, the normal kind of theodicies or defenses as well. But my main difference is I don't take God to be, even the way that most theists take God to be, namely a being that's so much like humans that he has a moral qualities such that he's immoral or whatever, if he allows a certain amount of evil to happen.
So my first question would be something like, when we think of suffering and evil and good, we're trying to compare it to our moral intuitions. We think that we have some grasp of what morality is, and if there's some obvious contradiction between our moral intuitions and whatever God does, then that seems to be good reason to believe that the God doesn't have a good grasp of morality, because we think, I'm a moral realist, I believe you are as well, that there is some objective morality and that our intuitions tell us something about that objective morality. So, for example, drowning babies is bad. We typically agree that that's an immoral thing to do, to drown babies. And so if God, for example, did the world flood, he drowned millions of babies, and so that's clearly bad. And so in that context, the argument is not specifically trying to argue that God's nature isn't goodness or something from that perspective. It's saying more that if we start from an evidential perspective, if we have some grasp of morality given our intuitions, and the description given of God in the Old Testament seems to contradict those profoundly, simply to say that there is some nature of goodness and God is okay to do this because he has some nature of God isn't engaging with a problem. So it's kind of like if we say Hitler gassed babies. Well, if Hitler's nature is goodness, that's fine. But the point is, we're making an evidential claim from our intuitions here. We think we know what morality is, and we think that is not it. And so we have really good reason to conclude that God or Hitler in that case is not moral, because they're doing something so obviously contradictory to our moral intuitions. And so even though I don't necessarily have to give a strong definition of what morality is, I can say my intuitions get some grasp of morality, where I at least have one example of something which I think is irrefutably moral or immoral, and that contradicts the nature of the God being or the actions of the God being given the text.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying we can't do, is that you're ascribing a moral character or moral attributes to the divine being, which I'm saying we're not. That's what I'm saying we can't do. So, no, we shouldn't go drown babies, and we shouldn't go do these kind of things. Although God, as a creator and sustainer and author of all existence and life, if he wants to judge his creation by doing certain things like that, then he is God to do that. What I'm saying is we don't judge God in the way that we would judge each other, because he's not a human being.
Well, what would be the difference there? So like if God did drown the world, and that did end up drowning millions of babies, why would it be a categorical error for me to say God is immoral because he did this thing which is the opposite of morality in my view?
Why is it wrong to say God is immoral?
Yeah, so you said it would be wrong to apply morality or moral labels to a God, and I would say that if God did an action like drowning babies, then it would be perfectly accurate to say he was immoral for doing that action. Why would it be wrong to apply?
So let me back up and just stop me if I get going too long with this. So this is why I say we start as theists oftentimes with the wrong direction, trying to say, okay, here's evil and here's how God fits with that. So as a Thomist, we're going to argue for God based on certain theistic proofs, cosmological proofs, that God is a necessary, infinite, non-contingent kind of being, transcends time and space, is eternal, simple, all that. So if those arguments are sound, and if our conclusions are true, then God is a being that is infinite, nothing like us. He's necessary. He is not a human being. So we can't take properties that are uniquely ascribable to human beings, like temporal, changeable, spatial, and we're going to throw in moral, okay? Because those kind of things don't apply to the first cause or the first being. Now, we can say those arguments are unsound or the conclusion is false or whatever, but that's what we're starting with. And we're not starting with presuppositionalism like I know some Christians want to do. We're starting with external, real being in the world, our physical existence, and then trying to argue backwards to the nature of the cause. And so if we're right about the nature of the cause, then to be moral means that you are behaving in a way like you're supposed to, or you're behaving according to some standard that you're being judged against. And so what we're saying in the vein of Brian Davies is uh, whatever it means for God to be good, it cannot mean that he is being judged by some kind of standard or he's behaving properly in some sense. Again, he's the creator of all that exists in the finite world. And so if he wants to judge his creation in a certain way, it's his as the owner of creation to do that. We can't do it unless he chooses to use us as that instrument. But that's why I think it's a category mistake to say that God is moral or immoral, because those describe categories that require some kind of a standard that would have to be, in a sense, over God in some transcendent way that I just don't see what that standard would be.
Right. So that's why I thought, like, if our intuitions tell us that there is such a standard, so we have moral intuitions, they tell us what morality is. So there is a standard there. And we think
Okay.
we find like a corner of this standard. So any object that has 3 sides and the angles add up to 180, the internal angles, it's a triangle, whatever.
Okay.
We can similarly say that if we find some descriptive label of what the standard is, we can then apply that to any hypothetical entity that could potentially exist. So we say anything that drowns babies is immoral. God drowned babies. God is immoral. So like, just like we could say, if we know what a triangle is, anything that has 3 sides and the internal angles at up to 180 degrees is a triangle. And we see an object and it doesn't have those properties, then it's not a triangle. And so even though I can understand from your perspective, you're starting with arguments for the existence of God, and if you assume these is true, then here's the definition of God or whatever. Going with just the problem of evil, which starts with our moral intuitions and says our moral intuitions tell us something about the standard of morality,
Uh-huh.
and the descriptors of this thing are in conflict with that standard. So I grant that there does have to be a standard, but our intuitions seem to tell us something about that standard. And so it would, I don't understand why we can't use that as an inclination that there is a standard. And then once we have this, try to apply that to a hypothetical model of what we think the origin creator is.
Well, I think there's a standard too, but see, and this is where I differ with most Christians as well. So most Christians will say that God is the standard of our morality, right? So I just reject that. So the standard of morality is human beings, human nature. So God, I would say, is the efficient cause of our morality and our existence, but he's not the formal cause, to use Aristotle's terms, which would mean he would be imposing his own former nature on us. So what I mean with all that is just to say that while God has created us, he's created a human nature or a human essence, such that when certain things are done to those humans by humans, it makes it either promotes or prohibits the good. So, for example, if a lion kills a human being, it would be an evil in a sense. It'd be a moral evil. We probably wouldn't call it a moral evil. I mean, it'd be a physical. We wouldn't call it a moral
I
evil.
would, but I have a strange view of morality. So
Okay. But we wouldn't try the lion for murder or something like that. Probably we'd probably euthanize him or whatever. But there's a different category for when a lion kills a lion or when a lion kills a human. Now, when a human kills a human, just out of straight murder, that would be a different thing altogether, because of the nature of the thing that we're talking about. So humans have a certain nature that I think God has created and given us an objective nature. I'm glad to hear that. I guess you hold to an objective, you should be
yep.
moral realist, objective moral principles. So I think that the standard that God has given us is kind of what you've been talking about. This, I don't use the word intuition, but kind of this nature that we have a sense of, understanding of through our reason. If you want to call it innate, or that's kind of close to it, or intuition. But the standard wouldn't be something that's infinitely non-human. This is why I say to my Christian friends, so we're going to say that an infinitely non-human is a human standard. It doesn't even make any sense, because if God is timeless, spaceless, changeless, simple, all those things that make up classical theism, and we're the opposite of that. We're contingent, finite, physical, and everything else that goes with being limited. And it just doesn't make any sense to say that the opposite of human nature is our standard. We would still have an infinite gap even if there were such a standard. But what I argue is it doesn't make a lot of sense to say that a infinitely non-human is what humans should try to be like. We should try as humans to be what humans are supposed to be and not judge an infinitely non-human by a human standard?
Yeah, so my initial thoughts are like, if I were to say there is a morally perfect world A and a perfect world B, do those sound synonymous?
A morally perfect world and a
Yeah, so
perfect world?
yep,
Did you mean leave the word moral out, the second one? Is this
yep.
a technical? Yeah, that could be distinct.
So yeah, they're distinct worlds. From my perspective, I think that if we limit the word morality to mean human action, we can have a morally perfect world where just nobody murders one another or whatever,
Okay.
but there's still death and suffering and pain and natural disasters, natural evils. From my perspective, what I think morality is, morality would include all of those things. So those are all, it would get rid of all of the evils. And so a morally perfect world would, by my definition, be synonymous with a perfect world. And so if I say, by my definition, an immorality is anything that causes the drowning of babies ever. It doesn't
Okay.
matter what properties it has. Makes no difference to me if it's a rock. I don't care.
Okay.
This is an immoral fact of that universe that shouldn't be there. And because it's simply defined by the consequences from my perspective, it wouldn't make a difference what properties God has. If he could drown babies, he's immoral. I don't care what he's made of.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, what, just out of curiosity, what, I guess, what standards do you think God has to adhere to?
Well, I would say
To
that
be able
if
to
there
call-
was, oh, go ahead.
That's it. If you're going to call God immoral, I know a lot of people do that, and Christians want to make God, justified so it's not immoral too. Um, I guess I just don't know what kind of a standard that would have to be necessary and eternal and having some kind of obligations on God to make him be that. So what would that be?
All right. So I think that using the evidence of our moral intuitions, moral progress, and philosophical dilemmas, we can come to a principle that a morally perfect world is a world where it would be impossible to force any being to do anything they don't consent to doing. That would be what I think is the objective best of all possible worlds. That I think is the
Okay.
perfect moral standard. And that could be instantiated by a number of things, some kind of natural law like gravity or something, a platonic object, a pure abstract, who knows? But I think that's an accurate description of what the moral principle is. And so
Okay.
for God to not be immoral, he would have to adhere to that principle, and any world he would create.
Where'd the principle come from? Is I guess what I'm trying to ask.
Well,
This
that's
is the
just
way Jim Sturba argues. Are you familiar with Jim Sturba?
vaguely.
Okay, so in his book, "Is a Good God Logically Possible?" he argues this. So there's all these kind of, um, hard to pin down what he thinks these principles are, but kind of these eternal abstract notions of these principles, like you're kind of describing. And I guess one thing that we have a problem with is just where do they come from? Are they just he thinks any rational being, for example, would have to adhere to these. But the question is what is this? What is this principle? Where does it come from? And what's the binding effect on it? Because it would seem to have to be eternal and necessary, just like God is. But I mean, do you think it's a real thing? Is it like an abstract
Yes.
object, or is it? It's like an
I
abstract
don't.
object.
I don't think
Real?
abstract objects. I'm a nominalist. I don't think abstract objects are real things. But I think
Yeah.
that this is.
Well, not in that sense.
But yeah, so I think that like a law of physics, like gravity, is a descriptor of an actually existing thing, curvature of
Okay.
space time or whatever. And I
Uh-huh.
think the law of morality is similarly a description of an actually existing thing. Like it could be a platonic object, could be a force in nature. I don't really know or care. I think
Okay.
it does exist. And now, once I think it does exist as an object, and I can describe that object with the principle or describe its effect with a principle, then I can say this is the standard which I'm using to compare other things to assess whether or not they're moral. And
So you
I
think that that principle is separate from humans, is what you're saying?
yes, a moral
Yeah.
realist. I think it's true, independent of any opinions.
Okay.
And so, if this thing does exist, just hypothetically, if it exists, then this is the standard that we can use to contrast to assess is any given thing, moral or immoral. And from my perspective, I think it does exist because moral realist. I'm looking at the evidence. I think there's actually a pattern there, and I think it does point to something. And what actually instantiates that doesn't really make a difference to the argument. As long as something instantiates it and it does exist, then it's completely valid to contrast it to a God and say God doesn't meet the standard. So if
Okay.
my assessment of the evidence is correct that this principle accurately describes whatever is instantiating morality, then any object that does not meet this standard would by definition be immoral, just like any object that didn't have three sides and didn't the angles didn't add up to 180 would not be a triangle or something like that.
Okay. I guess a couple of questions, if you don't mind. One, so you want to hold the standard as binding on all, I guess, rational beings.
Well, I'd say
But
everything. So my strange view of morality is that it includes laws of physics. I think that the
oh,
laws
okay,
of physics are immoral, rocks are immoral, but that's slightly off topic.
okay, that's interesting. I've never heard that before, I guess. Um, so you don't know what the law is or where it comes from, but we're all adhering to it. I guess I'm not following. You're not clear on that because that seems to be a
Uh,
problem.
so I know what the law is,
Okay,
and we're not all adhering to it. Obviously, we're not
right,
moral.
right.
But I'd say that if we look at patterns in moral intuition and moral progress and how our moral intuitions change over time, there's a pattern to it. Women's rights, Indian slavery, workers' rights, veganism, LGBTQ rights. There seems to be a pattern in the way in which our morals change over time, given technological and intellectual growth. And if we follow this pattern and extrapolate where it would go in the future, we can try to describe this pattern with the principle. And the principle, I think, that would accurately describe this pattern as it was in the past and as it is in the future is that as we gain more technologically, more resources, more intellectual capabilities, the scope of morality will increase such that any violation of consent or forcing anyone to do anything they don't consent to will be considered immoral once we get to the end of this road.
Okay.
And so I
So
think that looking at
things
the pattern, I can find the principle.
okay, so looking at the changing morality, as you called it, are you saying the principle itself doesn't change and we're kind of off kilter with the principle and trying to come back to it? Is that what your view is?
Well, I think it's kind of like gravity. It's like it's pulling us towards this end goal. And so we are far away from this end goal. Like, obviously, if gravity was the strongest force in the universe, everything would be collapsed into a ball.
But you're
It's
not saying
not.
that because we're changing our views that morality is subjective. That doesn't sound like what you're saying at the beginning, anyway.
So
Right?
I think that this is the like force of gravity or force of morality. So the force of morality is this principle. And if morality was the strongest force in the universe, it would create a world where it's impossible to force anyone to consent to do anything they don't consent to do. And as we grow in technology, we're moving closer to that because it's taking over. It's becoming the more dominant force, essentially,
Technology
as an
is
analogy. No, the morality is. So as technology grows, we can feel the influence of this law greater than when we're struggling for resources and have to kill kings to get food.
I don't want to take over your. So just tell me not to do this, but I'm just curious as to how you think technology helps because a lot of ways it seemed like you can argue it's making morality even worse. So I'm just not following, I guess, how that.
Well, I wouldn't say so. I think that like Steven Pinker's better angels of our nature show a pretty consistent pattern that morality is or human nature is in getting more inclusive, getting more moral, less violent, more tolerant.
Oh,
I
okay.
see a direct correlation to the amount of technology and the less harsh the people group. Like to think of pygmy tribes back in before we had technology 50,000 years ago. If you saw another guy from another tribe, the immediate instinct is kill him because if he gets back to his tribe, they're going to come kill us and steal all our stuff.
Okay.
We don't think that anymore. That's not a thing. There's typically an age of consent for marriage now. In China, it's 14. That's improvement. It didn't used to be that. So there's like a progress to the way we start to see things, and I think that we see that due to technological growth and when we aren't constrained by limited resources.
Okay. Does it not seem like a? I'm trying to figure out though what this principle is, and if you don't want to go that way, that's fine.
Well, I
Um,
define it as the principle is any involuntary imposition of will is immoral, something like that.
but you said it exists. So what? In what sense? You
Oh,
say you don't care, but is that not a problem for your view? So you don't care how it exists or where it came from?
Not exactly. So there are many
Okay.
different ways in which it could exist. It's kind of like saying, I believe in a God, but I don't know which one, kind of a thing. So like there's a thing there, it exists. I don't need to
Okay.
know which particular one is correct. It could be a platonic object, and that will be fine. It could be a force of nature, that will be fine. Could be an a priori abstract, and
So it's
abstracts actually
necessary and
exist.
eternal in some way,
It can be. It's
whatever
not a
it is.
requirement, but I'm happy to grant that for the sake of the
Okay.
argument.
If it wasn't, then it would be created or changing. So wouldn't that be a problem for your view?
What?
If it's changing, or if it was created in some way, if it's not eternal, it would have to have come into existence in some regard, right?
Right.
I'm just trying to follow you. So if it came into existence, would that mean something? What brought it into existence?
Well, it could just be random quantum randomness as far as I'm concerned. I wouldn't make much of a difference to my argument if it actually
But what makes
exists.
it objective then if it's based on just quantum theory?
True independent of opinion. is what objective means. As far as like gravity is objective, gravity changes. Gravity used to be repulsive at the early universe. So
Yeah.
I'm happy to grant, like, I like the idea that it doesn't change. I like the idea that it's eternal and
Okay.
unchanging. So I'm happy to grant that, but it would still be objective even if that wasn't the case, just like gravity is objective even if it changes.
All right. So could you say that both God and this principle exist, and God just isn't acting very well in accordance with it,
Sure, that's
or is it
logically
not?
possible.
Okay.
Yeah, God would exist, he'd just be immoral.
Okay. Yeah. So I guess you have other reasons besides the problem of evil for denying God's existence in that regard. And
Oh, right,
so
yeah, so
you're
the
an
problem of
atheist,
evil
not agnostic. Okay.
yeah, the problem of evil is only an argument that God isn't perfectly good or
Okay.
isn't perfectly all-powerful, kinda like the Epicurus or Epicurus quadrilemma thingy. So,
Yeah.
simply you could just say God exists, but he's evil, and that solves the problem of evil, no
Okay.
problem.
You can solve it that way. Yeah. Yeah, so I guess we're just going to take different starting points. So you could certainly stipulate, and this is what I think that people have done in this debate, is just to stipulate that God has to uphold this standard of goodness. But it seems like you have to have some kind of notion or accounting for what the standard is, where it came from, and knowing that God, then he's not God, it seems like, if that's the case. If he has to instantiate or behave in accordance with something that's, quote unquote, not him or external to him, I don't see how he would be ultimate then. So what I'm arguing for is that God is the infinite creator of all finite beings that exist, and there wouldn't be any such moral law apart from creation. Then God just doesn't fit in those categories.
Right, so I understand your argument, but mine's more like, if we grant that there is some loss, like we know we both agree gravity exists, right? Gravity is
Yeah.
a thing that's there. And if you say that there is this um, singular divine aseity thing that exists, but it's in conflict with gravity, well, then I'm probably going to be like, okay, that doesn't exist because we know gravity exists. Here is gravity. And so it seems very strange to say that that doesn't exist or
Uh-huh.
that there isn't this extra gravity standard that it's applied to or whatever. And I'm saying essentially an analogous argument in the case of morality. Like we know the law of morality exists, or the moral realists believe it exists. And if it exists, we can compare that to the hypothesized model of what if God exists. So if God exists, then he's perfectly moral,
Yeah, and
etc.
I agree that it quote unquote exists. I don't think it exists apart from humanity, though. So it's more of an abstraction for what we know about human nature, not something that exists. You said you're anomalous, so it can't be an abstract object or whatever. And I would agree that's not something out there, like a platonic entity or something like that, that we know it through our knowing our human essence. But if it's known through a human essence, then we can't get any further than saying, I don't think, that there's a human moral law that doesn't apply to, and you say this is different for you, to birds and rocks and trees the same way. And I would say that, okay, we can extrapolate this or abstract it from human nature, but why would you apply it to a non-human that's infinitely different from us, I guess?
Well, we can do
Which
thought experiments like
it sounds like from just the world in general. So in what sense, I guess, would it be different for a human to kill another human in cold blood, or a tree to fall on a human and just kill him? Is there not a difference in some regard there?
from my perspective, not as much. I think that killing anything without its consent is always immoral. I don't care if it's done by a
Okay.
rock or a person. Like for me, either of those is bad. Either way, that
Yeah.
universe is an immoral universe compared to some other universe where it didn't happen. And
Okay.
so if we can think about hypothetical, like if there is a being out there who has some supervenient consciousness far greater than ours or whatever, and it still kills somebody, is that immoral? And typically people say, yes, that's still immoral. It doesn't matter how smart it is.
Okay.
It'd be like us killing an ant or whatever, but it'd still be immoral. And so from our perspective, even if there is some greater level of existence, if it ends a conscious entity's life without its consent, that seems to always necessarily be immoral, especially if it has the power to do otherwise. So if it has the power to do otherwise to achieve the same ends without the immoral action, then that necessarily seems to prove that it must be immoral.
Okay. So there's not even a logical way, in your view, for there to be a being that's the creator of all things, maybe even the creator of this moral law that transcends it. There's something about the
Uh,
nature of morality that can't be transcended in that regard.
I'm not sure. So, like, for it to be objective, no, I think that would be a contradiction because objective means true independent of opinion. So if
Well,
it
I can grant that.
transcends it, well, if it
Mm.
transcends it, then it would be subjective. So it would be subjective to the God because it's contingent on its opinion. So for it to be true objectively, then that would mean it has to be objective to the God as well.
Okay, so when I say objective, I just mean there's something about the object that's not mind dependent. So if for you and I to be you and me to be humans, we have this moral law. So it's objectively the case. So it can be objectively the case that we're both wearing glasses, but it doesn't mean everyone's wearing glasses. It just means that we are. So it can be objectively the case, I would think, that humans can be moral without everything being moral. I mean, what's the difference?
Well, the truth
That
value of
humans have
this,
objective morality doesn't necessarily imply that non-humans have it.
well, the truth of the statement has to be independent of any conscious entity. So, like the fact that we're both wearing glasses isn't contingent on Bob. So say Bob imagines us both wearing glasses, therefore we're
Yeah.
wearing glasses. Well, that's a subjective fact because it's contingent on Bob's opinion now. And so, for morality to be objective, it has to be independent of any conscious entity's thoughts, not just ours.
Yeah. I'm not disagreeing that it's objective. I don't understand how we're going from humans have morality to non-humans have morality, which I guess is just being stipulated. I don't know what the difference is between the. So normally in philosophy, religion, or just this philosophical milieu in general, there's a difference between moral evil and a physical evil. Like a tree falling on somebody, killing was is not immoral. It's
Natural
physical
evils,
evil, right? Natural evil. Okay, I've never heard unless you're kind of a pantheist. I guess I've heard that take before. I don't take you to be a pantheist in
Well,
that regard.
I'm partial to naturalistic pantheism. I like naturalistic pantheism, as in which is essentially just naturalism, more or less.
Okay.
But I'd say that I believe there is a objectively best way the world could be morally, and I think the best way the world could be morally wouldn't just be no humans harming other humans. I think that age is still bad. I think death is still bad. Disease is
Yeah.
still bad. And
Right.
for a morally perfect world, because I think morality is um, a greater concept that encapsulates goodness, not vice versa, or their equivalent concepts. And so, for a morally perfect world, you would also have to get rid of all the other stuff too, the death and destruction and pain, regardless of just the human decision aspect or the consciousness decision aspect. I think that that's an aspect of morality, but I think that it's a broader concept that should apply to any version of infringement of will, including if a rock falls on you. I think that is an immoral fact about universe where that happens.
So do you make a distinction in the term or notion of goodness between like moral goodness and perfection, or just goodness in general, or does every kind of goodness have a moral aspect to it?
I would say every kind of aspect has a moral goodness to it. So I think that
Okay.
morality and goodness are almost synonyms.
Synonyms. Okay.
And so, from that perspective, if we're analyzing, say, the problem of evil, if God created a universe where a rock falls on somebody, God's culpable for this. He did an immoral thing. He created a gratuitous suffering that didn't need to be there. And I would argue that normally, I think you said you're against this, but people say there's some sufficient reason why God would allow this,
Right.
or something
Right.
along those things. And I would argue that because I like the logical problem of evil, I'd say there is no logically possible world where you can present to me some greater good that I can't achieve that without child cancer, or just to give a particular example.
Yeah,
And
that's pretty much what Sturd was arguing for, right?
yeah. What would be your take? Do you think that, from your perspective, would you argue against that simply by saying that it's a categorical error? You just can't apply morality to God in that way?
I mean, at bottom, yeah, because first of all, we don't take good to be completely univocal in all its applications, right? So I have things on my desk here. I've got a pen. I can talk about my car or the chicken that it's had for lunch. I can say those are all good. You're good. A golf shot is good. But what makes chicken nuggets good, or a car good, or a computer good, or a golf shot good, or you and I good, or whatever, doesn't seem to be the same. So we have more of an analogical view of being. I'm not sure if your view of being is more univocal across the board. It sounds like it might be, but I'm not sure. So what makes my phone good and what makes my water good are different. So to say X is good, you don't know a lot about it. You have to know what X is, right? So I know what, if I say my shoes are good, shoes are supposed to be have certain qualities, like they're supposed to be protective, comfortable, hopefully stylish, and all that kind of stuff. They're bad if they don't fulfill those kind of attributes or qualities. So we know what they're supposed to be. We know what a computer is supposed to be. We know what food is supposed to be. right? It's supposed to be tasty and nourishing, that kind of thing. A car is supposed to be protective and reliable and get you from one point to the other. So I think we think that goodness has an analogous nature, even among things I can just have in my room here and point to. So if goodness is kind of dependent on the essence or the nature of the referent or the thing in question, then what it means for X to be good isn't it might not be what it means for Y to be good. The goodness might be different based on what the thing is. And so yeah, humans can have an objective goodness, I think, and I agree with you on that. But we don't know, for example, what God's complete essence is. If he's infinite and we don't have any direct access to him from our senses, then we don't really know what God is. So it's hard to say, if not impossible to say, that God has quality X in this kind of regard of morality, especially because to be moral in the view that I take it to be, there has to be some kind of standard. Of course, you're positing some principle. I'm not sure where that principle would come from, where it would be, why God would have to be subject to it as an infinite being. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question. So yes, I would say that God just doesn't fit the category of morality, like it doesn't fit the category of any kind of finite being.
So if we expand it from morality to just goodness in general, we say that if we're trying to assess is God's creation goodness good, I would say that the criterion to establish if the creation itself is good is if there is no violation of consent, no forcing people to do things they don't consent to, including by rocks. If a rock falls on you without your consent, you've been forced to die without your consent.
Okay.
And so if for a God to live up to the standard of goodness in this case, he would have to create a world with no violations of consent, and doing so is a gratuitous evil from my perspective. And I think that is a plausible standard to apply to all things, not just subjectively to humans or the things in the creation. So I think it's reasonable to say that there is such a standard of goodness and it's caused by something. I don't necessarily need to know what. I could say it's a being, say it perfectly, a aseity being kind of a thing, but it's immoral, but doesn't have all the other properties. And there's other gods too, or whatever. But
Okay.
I think that it's more rational to conclude, based on our moral intuitions, that if there is a standard of goodness and morality, that positing a God who created the world as it is would contradict that than anything else. It seems like, since we agree there's objective morality and we agree certain things are moral, the Christian arguing against the problem of evil seem more kind of like, from the atheist perspective, more like Nazi apologist arguing that Hitler was perfectly good or whatever. It seems like it's so counterintuitive. Like, that doesn't make any sense. Especially given that God is potentially an all-powerful being. He clearly could have done things differently. Like, Hitler could
Mhm.
have potentially fed the children and given them homes instead of gassing them. And so the fact that he gassed them, there's no more stronger intuitive grasp that is immoral, that is bad, like that
Yeah,
is
they're
not the good.
right.
And so I say the same thing would apply to, if there was a God, even if we grant that there is this perfect state of being out there and he created the universe like this, that seems almost exactly one-to-one correlation to Hitler choosing to gas them instead of feeding them. And so God choosing to cause us cancer and suffer instead of giving us a world where it's impossible to violate consent, seems to be like a one-to-one argument in that case.
Yeah, well, Hitler in this example is another human being like we are. And we know what human beings are, so we couldn't say Hitler is good because we know what human essence and human nature is. So to say you're comparing Hitler with God, I think proves my point in saying that both theists and atheists want to judge God by just reducing him to a human kind of nature. And yeah, if you're going to do that, then fine, you can judge God in that way. What I'm saying is he's not a human. And so however we judge humans, we can't judge a non-human by that standard.
Well, so I think like the minimum requirement there would be is that God would have to have knowledge of our suffering, the ability to do things differently to cause less suffering, and to choose not to. As long as he
Mhm.
meets those four criterion, then it seems that's all you really need. So if that's what you're calling human, then I'm happy to grant that. But I'd say that even based on like the Thomistic definition of God, he probably has all of those things to some degree.
All the things where he could do things differently and has the power to.
Yeah, so he has the power to do things differently. He knows that we're suffering and we don't like it,
Right.
but chooses to do it anyway.
Yeah, and he's also made us free to be able to use free will, and I'm a compatibilist, so I think that we use free will in the way that God allows us to and has ordained things. Um,
Well, for the free will argument, I say that's one of the possible worlds where I can get that without child cancer kind of a thing. And so even if I grant that there's some good that he wants to achieve, I'd argue that there's always going to be a logically possible world where I could get that and without the given random example of suffering. And so there's two separate arguments there. One is that, is it fair to compare God to Hitler? And two is that, is there some justifiable reason to allow suffering? So the first one is, you were saying it's not fair to compare God to Hitler because Hitler is a human. And I'm saying that the only criterion required to make that comparison legitimate is if God has a mind, he's conscious, he knows that we're suffering, has the ability to do otherwise and chooses not to. And if that minimum criteria is met, then it seems to be a fair comparison, even if he's not a human. It doesn't matter, but as long as whatever other
yeah, if you want to
properties he
make those
has.
criteria your basis for judging a being, then yeah.
Well, do you think that's an unfair criteria to use? Because it seems pretty good, I think.
Yeah, for humans, I'm just saying that I don't see how we can take criteria that I think that's at least decent or good for humans, but to apply that to the creator of humans seems like we're taking something that is abstracted from what we know about human nature and applying it that has obligations. So we have a morality because we have obligations. You seem to agree with that. We have
Sort of
obligations.
indirectly. I think
Okay.
I'm a determinist, so I think obligations are post hoc. They're not
Okay.
inherent in morality. So as a side note, I would
Oh,
ask,
interesting.
is
Okay.
something moral because you ought to do it, or ought you do it because it's moral? Just like try to answer intuitively. How would you respond?
How would I? Yeah, I think that we have a human nature that God has given us. If you're giving me the kind of Euthyphro dilemma, is that what you're kind of going
No,
with
no,
this?
this is specifically about morality and ought. This has nothing to do with God here. It's just, is
Oh,
something
okay.
moral because you ought to do it, or
Yes.
ought you do it because it's moral?
I think that we have a certain nature that we have as humans, and that certain actions promote or prohibit the goodness either of ourselves or other humans. And so when we're promoting the goodness or teleology, the design of that nature, then we're promoting that goodness, and therefore it's moral. It's kind of programmed into what we happen to be as our nature.
I'm not quite. So this isn't a question about like what morality is. It's more just a question specifically picking one of the horns of the dilemma. Like, is something moral because you ought to do it, or ought you do it because it's moral? So which one of those do you think is a more intuitive answer to? Is it moral because you ought to do it, or ought you do it because it's moral for any given action?
I don't think you can separate that from what a human nature is, because if you say you ought to do it because it's moral, that doesn't have any meaning apart from a human nature, a human being in that regard. So I
Well,
would
so
say,
the question is, just to clarify, it's like the first thing is something moral because you ought to do it? There's like a bubble of all the things that make up morality, and there's a bunch of properties in there, and oughtness is one of the properties inside of morality. Whereas if you ought to do something because it's moral, that means there's the bubble with all the properties, and then oughtness is out here.
that
It's not a part of the
that's
bubble.
not the same thing as moral. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's when I ask most people, they pretty much always intuitively say, "Oh, we ought to do it because it's moral." It's not we don't it's not moral because
There are
we ought to
moral
do
things
it.
that
That seems
don't
very
have oughtness.
strange. So for me, it seems like the correct assessment of morality is that oughtness isn't a property of morality. It's not one of the things required for something to be moral. It's once we know the set of facts that make something moral, we then apply an oughtness to it. And so oughtness isn't inherent in morality from my perspective.
Ought is, you said ought is inherent in morality,
Is
or
not.
not? Did not, because
Is
you're okay.
not.
Okay.
That was just
Well, help
just
me
a side
understand
note.
your position. I'm confused at this point, because should what does it mean then? So one human being murdering another human being, there's no oughtness there that he shouldn't do that?
No, it's just a descriptive fact. So I think that the principle describes some object, some moral object, and you are not in correspondence to that object, and so you're immoral. So like you are not tall, or you are short, or whatever. You are not 6'2". It's just a fact. So morality is a fact of the matter. It's a fact of the universe. And if you do something immoral, it's just a fact you've done something immoral. And so it's a descriptive thing, like you're tall or short or white or black or whatever.
So you seem to be saying that if God, and I'm just trying to track your argument here, that if God is allowing children to die, he ought not do that. Is that not what you're saying?
No, he's just immoral. So I'm labeling him. He's immoral for doing it.
Well, what makes him immoral if he, because I thought you were saying he ought to not allow children to die, and he's immoral if he doesn't do that. I
No,
guess
that's
I'm just
more like
following you.
that would be more like a hypothetical imperative. So if you want to be moral, then you ought to do the moral thing. But
Okay.
from the categorical perspective, it's more like if God drowns babies, God is immoral. But what he ought to do is going to be contingent on his categorical imperative. So if he wants to be evil, that's fine. He's just evil.
Okay. I'm having a hard time taking the oughtness out of there because it seemed like you're saying that if God allows children to die, or any example, um, that's why he's immoral, because he's allowing those things to die because he has the power and knowledge to
Yep.
stop it.
Yep. But that isn't a ought statement. That is an is statement. So it's saying there is some object. There's like a measuring stick of morality,
So
and
God ought not to stop children from being gassed and dying from
well,
starvation.
the
That kind
oughts, I see are completely irrelevant. You don't need them at all. You need them for nothing in morality. They're completely irrelevant. So, like, if there is a measuring stick and anything that meets this set of criteria is moral and this set of criteria is
so
immoral,
should you not track the measuring stick? I mean, is there no oughtness with the measuring stick?
I don't know what that means.
I mean, should I not try to track morality? Because you said that our culture is going to track morality closer and closer as technology takes us down the road.
Yeah,
So ought not we try to go along with that measuring stick, wherever that measuring stick is?
if you want to be moral, hypothetically, sure, but what you ought to do is irrelevant. It's like saying, ought
I'm guessing
you
I'm really
try?
confused because you said, if I heard you right, that you ought to follow the measuring stick to be moral. Is that not what you just said?
If you want to be moral, then you ought to do the measuring stick morality thing. So
Okay.
hypothetical imperative, but all hypothetical imperatives are irrelevant. Like you are moral or you are immoral is a fact statement independent of any ought statements. Get rid of all ought statements. You're
So there's
still
nothing
either immoral or
there's
not.
nothing we should do.
Well, I think shoulds are hypothetical, subjective. So there's nothing objectively we should do. But if you want to be objectively moral, then you can subjectively try to pattern your actions to be objectively moral. Just like if you want to be good at basketball, you can practice being good at basketball. But you should. It's not like anything in the universe is saying you should practice basketball. It's more of just a statement of fact that either you are good at basketball or you are not good at basketball. It's either you are moral or you are not. And
So
so,
your intuitions of morality, there's no categorical oughtness there. Not to bring on, I mean, Kant's
yeah,
categorical way. I mean, um, our intuition of what, like I don't know how else to say this. We shouldn't go around killing people or hurting people on purpose. There's the intuition that has nothing to do with what we should or should not do, or ought not do.
right. So the should and shouldn't and ought not are purely human subjective additions that have nothing to do with morality. There's things that human society adds in. It's
Well,
completely
then what's the
irrelevant.
intuition of? Just the stick we're measuring everything with?
What?
What is the intuition we're having of then? Because when you said intuition, I thought you were taking kind of like a natural law-ish view of we have some conscience that we know what's right and wrong, but
Yeah.
I don't know how to make sense of that without there being some kind of oughtness.
Well, mine is still like good and bad. So it's because it's good or bad to have someone suffer without their consent. It shouldn't happen, but it's not like we shouldn't do it. It's just shouldn't happen. So it's the thing that the universe should not be possible for this to occur in the universe. It's not like we should try to do things that doesn't matter. It's the fact of the matter. This is a bad thing that should not have happened, should never happen, cannot happen. And so it's more of again just a descriptive fact of like if a rock falls, then the rock fell. It's not like
So
it's not.
I'm just confused as to what makes it moral. If it's just a descriptor of what's actually happening, then what's the supervening moral property on it then?
The standard of the universe. So, like, if the maximization of this property is a world where it's impossible to force anyone to do anything they don't consider doing, and if it's in correspondence to that principle or that world, it's
Okay.
moral. It has the
So then,
property of being in correspondence with that principle.
are you saying then that we ought not make people do what they don't want to do?
Yes, that would be a shorthand for way to phrase it.
We
You
ought
shouldn't.
not make people do what they don't
If you
want to do.
want to be moral, you ought not do things. But again, the ought's irrelevant. You can get rid of
I
the
don't.
ought and just say.
Yeah, I don't understand how to make sense of you ought to do something, but it's irrelevant.
So if
Okay,
you are 6'1", you are 6'1".
that's not a
Done. I know
moral
there's
problem.
so the morality is the exact same. If you kill someone, you are immoral. I don't care about oughts. It's a fact. It's a descriptive fact, just like you are 6'1". So there is some moral ruler, and if you do one of the immoral things, you are immoral in the same way that you are 6'1".
But
You
we
have
shouldn't
met
do
the
those things, right?
criterion.
You're
Oh, so
saying
that's
that's
irrelevant.
irrelevant.
I
Uh,
never said out in anything I said there.
I don't know how we could. I'm having a hard time understanding here. It's fine, but I mean, it doesn't make sense to say we ought not to impose ourselves on people or hurt people. So we should ought not do that, right? We ought not kill people.
Well, again,
That's irrelevant.
yes, a human addition that makes no difference to morality. It's completely irrelevant. So, like,
So we're not. So are we being immoral when we do it?
yes,
So is there not a correlation between what we ought to do and whether or not our actions are moral? Because you ought to be moral.
completely subjective. So, if you want to be immoral, then what you ought to do is immoral things. And so it's completely subjective on the individual what you ought to do. Um, but what you morally, if you're moral or immoral, is not, it's objective. So if you kill someone, you are objectively immoral. Just like if you add 1 + 1 and get 2, you are objectively doing math. If you subjectively want to do bad math, you can say 1 + 1 = 7, but you're still objectively doing math badly. So if your subjective goal is to be moral, then you ought to do moral things. But
Okay.
the fact of the matter of the actions you do, whether it's moral or not, completely independent of any oughts, any subjective reference frame whatsoever.
Okay.
So going back to the problem of evil, um, I imagine you're against like the logical problem of evil more like what, from your
Like
perspective,
person, or what do you mean?
well, like, because typically academics don't like the logical problem of evil. It's more the evidential problem of evil is preferred,
Right.
essentially from like Plantinga's free will defense, something
Mm-hmm.
like those. That there could be some logically possible sufficient reason or something.
Yeah.
But from your perspective, you're kind of making like a logical problem of not evil because you can't even apply the category to God or something along those lines.
It's more of a metaphysical argument because it's kind of based on what the thing is, not just a logical point or anything, but the nature of what God is and what we are and all that.
And I kind of wanted to bring it back to like the Hitler example is like,
Okay.
to me, that seems like reverse engineering solution to the problem, kind of like just saying, well, or Hitler's perfectly good or whatever. Do we have any reason to believe that? That would be my initial question is,
And there's a problem to believe that Hitler is good.
like God in this case. So if we look around the world and say there's lots of bad things that happen, um, what reason do we have to conclude that God would be perfectly good as opposed to being evil? If we're like trying to assess the evidence and make a conclusion about the nature of this being,
Okay.
why would we conclude it's good?
Okay. So in our theistic proofs, and I'm more of a classical guy when I go along the theistic proofs, follow more Aquinas and his overall Aristotelian metaphysic, that being and goodness are basically convertible. So if our arguments about God are sound, then what we're trying to demonstrate through finite being and finite existence is an infinite being and infinite existence. So the way that a lot of folks use the word evil is that there's some kind of course, we make the distinction between moral evil, natural evil, whatever, but there's some kind of a imperfection in what's going on there to make it evil. All right, I'm not sure how you define evil, but a lot of Christians define evil kind of in the Augustinian way of there being a corruption or a privation of some goodness. With God, if our proofs are sound and good and everything, then God will be an infinite being that lacks nothing, is not metaphysically corrupt, lacking some kind of goodness or being, and is not only private. He is pure, infinite being in existence. So since goodness is the way Aquinas, following I think Aristotle, describes it as that which is desired or desirable and full in its being, then God will be complete infinite being and therefore complete infinite goodness.
Well, why would you? I'm not following the connection between goodness and being there. So it's like if I wanted to say, um, existence is perfectly pineapple. They're synonymous terms. It seems like you could just add in anything you wanted to and say it's synonymous with being or whatever.
So we're saying what the thing is. So if I'm a human, so I'm saying it depends on what you're talking about. So if I have and the typical example is vision. which I have bad vision, so it's appropriate. An eye, to be a good operating eye, would operate appropriately without any kind of corruption or privation of what it should have. Okay, my eyes are all messed up. I can't see very well. Okay, so then there's some kind of a lack of the goodness that it's supposed to have. So it's not what it's supposed to be. That's the classical, a general classical view of what goodness and evil are. Goodness being things being or existence. Again, following Aristotle and Aquinas. So you can't just take something and say pineapple, because there's no. The pineapple can be good if it's what a pineapple is supposed to be. If it's rotten, then it's not good, because it's not what it's supposed to be as a good pineapple. If I'm following what you're saying, right?
Well, my argument is more like it seems like goodness has nothing to do with being. It's kind of a ad hoc property you're just adding in to fit a hypothesis. So, like if I wanted to pick a different property, like pineapple is just an example, I don't see the connection between being and goodness. Like there's no logical contradiction with a universe with no goodness. Just moral subjectivism or moral non-cognitivism or something. Like there's just no such thing as goodness. That doesn't seem like there's a logical.
Are you using goodness in the moral sense there, or just in the physical general sense of goodness?
In any sense, I'm trying, like, it doesn't seem like there's a logical contradiction with there being no objective concept of goodness, just being a subjective product of evolution or something. And the universe exists and has being, and it's in its existence, but has no goodness quality to it. Whereas what you're saying is that existence is synonymous with goodness in some way. But to me, they seem like separate categories, they have separate entailments that don't seem entwined in any way. Just like existence and pineapple aren't entwined. You can have a universe without a pineapple, no logical contradiction, just fine.
Right.
And so the same thing seems to apply to goodness. And so I don't see the necessary connection between the two.
So do you understand what I'm saying with just like the vision? Except my arm was missing, that would be an evil, right? Because I'm supposed to have 2 arms and 2 legs. Would you not call that an evil?
If you wanted if you wanted 2 arms, yes.
Or a corruption, or
yes.
a corruption of what it's supposed to be.
Sure.
Or a privation of what's supposed to be there.
Sure, I'd say it's immoral if you wanted 2 arms and you didn't have 2 arms.
Okay, so I think that going along with you're a nominalist, I'm an essentialist. That's going to be a more fundamental difference in our overall views. So I'm a realist in that regard. So I think that there is an object of human nature that we're supposed to have 2 arms, 2 legs, and what it means to be a human. And so goodness means that a thing just to use your word, I don't like the word greatly, but instantiates what it's supposed to be, right? So if a human is good if it is what it's supposed to be. There's both metaphysical aspects of goodness there and moral.
And you're saying that also applies to the relation between being and goodness or something like that?
Well, for Aquinas, goodness is something that is in a sense convertible with being. But what makes it a little bit different in our mind is that it's something that's desirable. Now, of course, it can be somebody can have bad or evil desires. He desires to kill people or whatever. But things that are more perfect or more actual, going along with Aristotle's overall metaphysics of what it means to be or exist. So Aquinas, in saying that, means that a thing has more actuality if it has all of the existence it's supposed to have. It's not missing anything. It's not corrupt or private or whatever.
I'm still lost on the connection that you're saying being is synonymous with goodness. And
so you're a good human in a metaphysical sense if you're not missing things. Your existence is you're complete, in other words.
But how would that apply to God? So like in that analogy, I'd say that God must have a purpose that is outside of him, and if he meets this purpose, then he's good, or something along those lines.
Yeah, so along with his nature. So God's nature would just be infinite being. So if we define good, if we understand evil as a corruption of goodness in some respect, something that shouldn't be, if there's a being that has infinite being, then he's not lacking what he should be. He's everything he should be because he has pure existence.
But why are we calling this goodness? Because Frank in the chat asked, why couldn't it be perfectly evil or whatever? It seems like...
Because there's a distinction between a moral evil. Well, then it wouldn't be infinite. If he had evil, then it would be a privation. Then he wouldn't be infinite. Then he wouldn't be the kind of God I'm talking about.
Well, it's more like the question that the anti-realists ask. Like, even if there's some direction to moral progress, why is the up direction moral and the down direction immoral? It seems like you can just flip them and say the up direction is immoral and the down direction is moral. And so, even if there is some relation between this property and being, this doesn't tell us anything about the goodness itself. Like, what is goodness? Maybe goodness is to drown babies, something ridiculous. Seems like if you're simply defining goodness as the nature of whatever this being's infinite essence is, well, that could just be anything. Just anything that exists, that is the fundamental nature of reality, could have that quality to it, and you just have to call it goodness by
Say that
definition.
again. What, anything could have that quality?
Yeah, so if we
I'm not.
imagine
Okay.
different logically possible kinds of gods, like Satan, just Satan was the most powerful essence of everything in the universe.
Okay.
It's whatever nature it particularly has would by definition be goodness by that definition, because goodness is just whatever the infinite being is.
Yeah, I'm just saying that in the classical view of God, there's infinite being. Satan doesn't have infinite being. He's limited to a certain contingent subscription of what he is as a thing, and he's corrupted. So it can't be anything that you just want to imagine. It would have to be something that has no limits, that has no properties of creation, like nothing that's temporal, changeable, spatial. Anything that can be contingent would have to be negated of that being, which means that it can't have any kind of limits on its existence. It would be infinite. It would be unchangeable, and all of the whole ball of classical theism. So it can't be just anything. It would have to be an infinite being of pure existence. And Satan
Okay,
doesn't have that. Couldn't be.
well, to use the most basic example, think Christian God, but he decided not to make Jesus, did it a different way. Said, I'll just forgive you for your sins, no Jesus-y thing. So
Okay.
has all of the other properties of God, but changes his psychology in such a way that the actions that are caused from his creation are slightly different.
Well, the
And so
creation of
there's
Jesus is not a change in the divine being. It's an addition of a human being.
right.
So it's not a change in the divine being one way or the other. And he didn't have to make Jesus. He didn't have to do that in the physical human nature anyway.
Right, but there's a variation among the personality of God that can change quite a bit. But it would still, no
Not in
matter what
classical theism.
what
Not in classical theism. If God is simple and unchangeable and eternal and not part of a temporal succession and as pure actuality with no potentiality whatsoever, going back to Aquinas' first way, then no, there can't be any kind of a change in God's nature.
well,
Or
that's
any,
only given the
not
specific
sure.
definitions of Thomism. But so from our perspective, if we see a God who created Jesus versus a God who didn't create Jesus, we would describe that as a personality difference. We'd say there's a difference in the personality of these two things. Even if you want to say he's still a perfectly
What's
divine
the person
deity,
being changed? The human Jesus or the divine aspect of God? I'm not saying what you're saying is
just the personal Jesus. So the divine aspect
personal.
of God
So
can
the
still
second
be
person Trinity or the human aspect, because there's a distinction there in terms of the
uh
essence.
just he didn't come as a human. There's no human Jesus.
How does that change the divine being?
It doesn't. That's the point.
Okay, I'm not following your point then, because
So
we don't
if
disagree with that.
if we imagine that there is a God who would send Jesus as a human to die on a cross or whatever, and we imagine a different alternative where that didn't happen, we would
Oh,
describe
God's
that.
knowledge being different? Is that what you're going with
No,
this?
so I'm just
Okay.
saying you can say there's no difference with the God whatsoever from
Okay.
a Thomistic definition, but
All
we
right.
would say that there's a difference. We would say he must have had a different thought, a different idea, a different
So his knowledge would
personality.
be.
Maybe I have no idea.
I thought that's what you're getting at, because his knowledge would be different from World 1 to World 2.
Well, maybe I don't know. Like all I'm
I'm not.
saying
I'm
is
not
like
following. I'm not. I guess I'm not following you still then, because.
my argument is that whatever you define God as being, you can say he's
Okay.
perfectly aseity. That's fine. He would be perfect aseity with or without Jesus' human form on body. That doesn't make a difference.
Right.
So we would then, without any kind of Thomistic language, we would just colloquially define that as a difference in personality.
Yeah, from
God
our point
A,
of view.
yes. So there's a vast array of things that we would describe as a difference in personality, regardless of whether or not the defined aseity is true or not.
Okay.
There's a lot of different things he could have done that we would describe as a difference in personality. So that spectrum is huge, so much so that we could think that whatever we think of as Satan, whatever we think of as the action Satan would do, could be done by the God, and you could still say he has divine aseity. He still has all the divine aseity properties, But just like he could have sent Jesus in a human form, or he could have not sent Jesus as a human form. He could have done whatever Satan would have done, and he'd still have the property of being divine aseity.
Can you give me an example of that? What would Satan do that God could have done that wouldn't change his? I mean, Satan is a contingent, finite being, and I'm arguing that God is an infinite being, so I don't see how that can be comparable in any way.
Well, so like I'm thinking about only the consequences here. So if you think about God choosing to make Jesus versus choosing not to make Jesus versus choosing to do whatever action Satan would have done. So if Satan was in this situation where he was going to do something, what would he have done? And Satan is obviously a contingent being, so I'm not saying Satan is God. I'm saying if Satan had done something like, I don't know, kill the firstborn of all the different people in Rome or whatever, who knows? Just pick a random thing. And God did that instead. He's like, I'm just going to kill all the firstborn in Rome because that's what Satan would do, or hypothetical.
Because that's what Satan would do?
No, not because, just as an analogous argument. The spectrum between sending Jesus as a human being to die on the cross to not sending Jesus to killing all the firstborn, all of that spectrum would still fit with the definition of divine aseity. It seems like, based on your definition, it seems like whatever God does, no matter what it is, he's always going to fit that definition. And there's essentially an infinite amount of spectrums of actions he could take.
There's different things he could do. I'm guessing I'm not following what the therefore is with all this comparison.
The classical example is saying, could God be evil? Could there be an evil God? Which from our
that would be contradiction of what I'm saying.
Well, so evil in this case would be the colloquial definition. So if God was such a being that would kill every baby in Rome or whatever, we would define that as evil. But
I'm not using a colloquial definition. I'm using a technical philosophical definition. So no, there'll be a contradiction in God being infinitely in existence and being evil. Those are contradictions, and that's why that's one way that we talk about goodness and existence being somewhat synonymous. Because if you're lacking something, you're lacking existence in some way. So no, I don't see how we can compare Satan or any finite thing to God, because or saying God is evil, because that would mean that God is an infinitely finite being, and that's a contradiction.
No, so what I mean is like
that definition of evil.
So I'm using the two words, two different definitions, the colloquial definition and the technical definition, in the same argument here. I'm trying to differentiate between them, though, as best I can. So the question is could God mass murder everybody he wanted to and torture them and be the worst world possible, but still be perfectly good by your definition because he still has all of existence? And if that's the case, then that leads to a counterintuitive conclusion.
I'm not saying you can do.
Well, that's the part I'm trying to lead to, is like, because there's a spectrum in the actions he could take, like sending Jesus versus not sending Jesus versus killing the firstborn of every Roman. That spectrum would seem to include torturing everyone he wants to, or torturing everybody.
Yeah, I'm just going to deny that, because torturing would mean that, again, would be a contradiction in saying that God is doing something. He's willing people's good and not willing their good at the same kind of quote unquote moment, which I'm denying that this just can't be done. Of course, God can judge people based on their sin, but God isn't just going to go around torturing people, because that's not what that's not what the human nature was designed for.
I'm not sure, because isn't it what we're designed for contingent on his nature in the first place?
On whose nature?
God.
No, our nature is objectively what it is because God has created it.
Right.
Is that what you're saying? Yeah.
Yeah. And so if there was a God who created us to be tortured and then tortured us, he would still be perfectly good.
If he created us to be tortured, then okay. But that's not what we're saying humans are for. But yeah, if there's something that was created to be tortured, that would probably have a logical problem or a metaphysical problem with what it is, because it's with the kind of thing in question. But that's not what humans are.
So the argument here is, if you define God as perfectly good, and which means
in the moral sense or just in the metaphysical sense?
Metaphysical sense. So goodness being synonymous with being, and God's nature is such that he designs beings so that they can be tortured and then tortures them.
So that they can be okay.
Yeah, so he designs them so they can be tortured and tortures them. So they're supposed to be tortured and he tortures them.
Supposed to be tortured, okay.
And by this definition of goodness being synonymous with being, it seems like the only criterion that's required to be good is that you do things consistent with your nature. And from the colloquial sense, that would be the wrong term to use here. We wouldn't call that goodness. It seems like goodness has other entailments to it,
I
like
wouldn't call it
can't
goodness either, because
torture.
being tortured, that's gonna be a contradiction. A good torturing and what a good human is and its flourishing are contradictory, because what it means to be human means that you're not being tortured if everything's going well. I mean, the human nature is not good if it's being tortured. So that would again be a contradiction of a metaphysical sense, maybe even a
Well,
logical.
that would only be a contradiction if being a good human somehow precluded God. Like if that's an objective thing independent of God, then it would be a contradiction. But it seems like it's
I don't think so.
contingent
But
on God.
if just what it means to be a human means that you have certain goods that you should attain, like eating and being safe and whatever you want to make the list of being, that this is good. These are good properties to be well fed, to be happy, to be whatever you want those to be. Then to say it's good to take all that away and torture somebody is a contradiction.
Well, aren't all those things contingent on God's purpose? Those are only good because God designed us for those things, right?
I think where you and I are talking past each other is this distinction made about him, sin, and God. So there's a distinction between God, between the suppositional necessity and an absolute necessity. So yeah, God did not have to make humans with the nature that we have. But supposing he did, then we have this nature. We just have it's almost a brute fact, as you're saying. It's just we're just kind of here. All right. So then the nature is just what it is, based on how God made it. So there are certain things that are good for humans. Like it's good to eat, it's good to be clothed, it's good to have shelter, it's good to X, Y, and Z. But being tortured isn't on that list, because that actually causes what we would consider a metaphysical evil, because you're taking away the goodness of the person, and probably a moral evil, because you're doing things that are prohibiting the goodness as well.
Well, so I think my argument is more general. I'm
Okay.
hypothesizing two different universes. One where humans haven't been created yet. Neither hasn't been created in either universe.
Okay.
Universe A is kind of like ours, where we were created by God to have the purposes that we have. Universe B, there is a God who created humans only to be tortured. There are no other humans. There are none of us in this.
Yeah, I'm
universe.
just gonna say that's a contradiction, because then it wouldn't be a human. Not in the sense that we think of humans. Because you're saying, so for God to make it part of their nature, what I mean as part of their nature means that brings about a good thing. Well, so you would have to have some kind of being that would bring about a good thing by being tortured, and that certainly isn't a human. That have to be some other kind of being.
Well, doesn't good thing just mean correspond to God's nature?
To God's nature? No, to its own nature. So I'm a good human if I act as the way a human should act. That's kind of my point. That
But so I
God
said
isn't
it's our nature is determined by God, right? God
our nature.
determines our nature.
Yeah.
Right. So if God determined our nature to be tortured, then us being tortured is a good thing, isn't it?
If there was a being like that, that's not a human being. But if there was a being like that, then sure.
Well, I'm not sure
I
why
don't
calling it human makes a difference there. Like
because
a human being, the
I don't think
nature of it.
a good thing for humans is to be tortured. Is what I'm trying to say.
Well,
There's no world where a human being tortured is a good thing for that human. It wouldn't be a human if it was brought about some kind of goodness for that human. That would just
so
deny what the
human
thing is.
nature, a human being's nature is determined by God, right? The nature
Yes,
of any given object is determined by God who created that object.
right. But here we are with the human nature, so you can't
Right.
change that nature now. It just is what it is. So you can't say that God's gonna torture you and me, and that's somehow good for you and me. That's just not what it means to be a human.
In this
Goodness.
universe where he's created it differently. But if God decided before ever creating humans with this purpose that he gave them a different purpose, there's no logical contradiction there. You could be like, yeah, your purpose as being a human is to be tortured, and I'm going to
Unless being
torture you.
tortured just is inherently destructive of the thing's being, if you go along with that notion of what evil is.
Inherently destructive of the thing's being. I'm not sure if I follow that part. So like,
Well, I mean, being tortured would mean like you're hurting, you're harming somebody. I'm not sure how that seems to be in the way that we define and understand goodness. Hurting, harming, and tearing apart a thing's body is just by definition an evil, because you're taking apart the parts, and and causing harm. Well, you seem to be saying that God can make something harmed where the harm is a good. Well, you have to, I think, redefine what good means to do that.
Uh, so my question here is that it seems like because goodness is synonymous with being, and God gets to define whatever our nature is. If God defines our nature as to be tortured, then that must necessarily be good.
Well, I think you're saying that God can make a nature any way he wants to, and I wouldn't say that. Like God can't make a square circle. So I would say he can't make a thing to where it's good for it to be destroyed, because then this is by definition destroying the goodness of the thing, where goodness means the inherent being and structure of that thing.
Okay.
So I guess you're saying God can make anything. There's no logical contradiction or logical parameters on what the thing is.
No, because I'm not saying you can create a round square here.
Okay.
It seems that
But to be tortured would seem to be causing harm, which would damage what the thing is. But in my view of what goodness is, a thing's goodness is what it is. It's good insofar as it is actual and what it's supposed to be. But to torture somebody, the way we understand torture in human beings, that would just be a contradiction. So I don't know of it being that its goodness would be to be tortured on that. We couldn't use a human as an example because this just wouldn't work.
Well, it seems like it works fine. Like if the goal is for, let's say, personality building, he wants you to suffer and be miserable and go insane, and that's your purpose. Therefore, torturing you achieves this end goal of personality. It seems perfectly logically consistent to say God created humans with the nature to suffer so that they go insane because that's what he wants, and that would, by your
Yeah, if you just
definition,
want to define God as that kind of being, I guess that's just not what the kind of God I'm talking about. Where God intentionally is a
well, the point of that is to say,
right,
if that
right.
was the case, you would still have to call that good by your definition, which seems like a contradiction with how
No,
it
I'm
is good.
saying that a thing's goodness cannot in any way be consistent with the destruction of that thing. So if you're supposed to be mentally sound, then driving someone crazy means that you're not mentally sound. So then it's not a good thing, and it couldn't be a good thing.
So the argument here is that God's nature, if goodness is synonymous with being, whatever God's does, you'd still have to call him goodness, because goodness isn't like, it has no descriptive power to it. So like if you say anything that exists is a potato, well then everything is a potato. So if you're saying that goodness is synonymous with being in the case that God exists, then whatever God does, you're still going to have to define him as goodness, even if he just tortures everybody. You just because goodness is synonymous with being.
Yeah, you're automatically saying something that can't be done. You're using an immoral example of anything being moral. You seem to be saying anything God does is good. God does this evil, therefore it's good. That's a contradiction. That's what I'm saying cannot be done. I guess we're just going to run in circles because you're giving these examples that are obviously evil.
Yeah.
And saying that what God is doing here, if he does this evil, therefore it's good. Well, no, it isn't. That'd be a contradiction.
Well, yeah, that's kind of what I'm trying to illustrate, is that seems like your definition can't differentiate between the two. It doesn't seem like there's any contradiction there. It just seems like that definition of goodness
I don't see why you take that, because I'm giving examples of actual things like human beings that have an actual objective nature that we know about from experience and know that our human essence is such where if we have X, Y, and Z, those are good things, and if we don't, they're bad things. So God can't create an evil good. He can't just call evil good, which it seems like what you're trying to say is that he can create an evil that's actually good. Well, then it's a contradiction.
Well, it seems like what your argument is that it's logically impossible for God to make human nature anything but what we experience it is now.
No, I'm saying that God just has made human nature what we experience it now. So supposing that God makes a human being, whatever that is, then that's just what it is. So in our experience, what you and I are humans, and we're not going to change that because God just has made that nature to be what it is. You don't have to.
I'm not arguing against our current human nature. I'm saying God could logically possible have created human nature to be something different than what it is now, like to be tortured. You could have done that.
That's my last time saying this. We're going over in circles. That's not my position, because to be whatever a thing is to be good means that it is what it's supposed to be in an actual sense, not to be taken apart. But for example, to be a human being, and you can say it's meant to be tortured. Well, the inherent notion of being tortured is to be harmed or to be taken apart in some way. Well, that's just contradictory to what my view of good is. So you're saying that to be harmed is a good, but I'm saying no, to be harmed is to do damage to a thing's nature. So I'm just not saying that at all, and I don't know what there would be in an example of that.
Well, right. So I'm saying that no, it's not harming them. It's harming them in the case it's causing them suffering, but it's causing them to build character. So it's actually helping them. It's
There's torturing
even
that's
though
not harming them.
right, it's building their
That seems
character.
incoherent. Okay.
I'm not sure why that's so. Like physical suffering, like building muscles, could potentially cause growth. So torturing could character build in some way,
Okay.
and so the fact that he's torturing you was for a purpose. Um, and so there doesn't seem to be like a logical contradiction. It seems to be special pleading that you're just saying, I just can't do it, can't be done. So I don't have to address
No,
the
it's not special
problem.
pleading because the thing is being in question is a contradiction. Like saying God can create a square circle. Well, no, if torture brings harm onto a thing, and I don't see how I can have torture with no harm. I had a debate on torture a few years ago in the military, and there's an inherent long-lasting harm in torture. So torture is designed to bring harm, or otherwise you wouldn't do it. So you're saying that there's some regard. I got about 5 minutes, so I have to leave. There's some way you can bring harm onto some being that's good for it to be harmed, but harm means that it's against the thing's nature. So there's an inherent, I think, both logical and metaphysical contradiction. So I just don't see how that can be. Can you give an example of what that would look like? When you said the muscle thing, well, that's not torture, or even going to the gym would be being tortured.
Wait, so you said to harm is to go against something's nature. And so again, if God designed us,
If you're causing, I'm not saying anything possible is the going against its nature as according. So if I cut my arm, yeah, that's my nature has the potential to be cut, but that cut is a harm to me. It's not what I'm not supposed to be cut. I have the potential to be cut. I think maybe we're diverging here, where you're thinking that anything possible should be that way. Well, it's possible I could cut my arm off, but I shouldn't.
no, I'm saying more like anything that's logically possible, God could make our nature too. So if it's logically
I'm
possible
not.
for us to suffer, God could make that our nature.
No, I'm not. That if it's logically possible,
Yeah.
yeah, I think God can do anything logically possible, but I don't think having harm or torture being a good is one of those things.
I don't understand that because it seems quite logically
I
possible.
can't say it any differently. Yeah, if you don't know what harm and torture is bad for you, then I don't know how else to say that.
Well, no, I think it's only bad because God says it's bad under your worldview. That seems
You
to
think
be
it's bad only because God says it's bad? So okay.
that seems to be the necessary consequence of you simply defining God as good. And so
No, I think it's bad because you're bringing harm to the being in question, the actual nature. If you're causing harm to the nature, it's not because God is a certain way. It's because the being is being hurt or harmed in some way. And that seems like a bad thing if you're hurting something or hurting somebody.
and that's true independent of God.
Yeah, I'm not saying we have to. Yes, but God has made the human nature to be a certain thing, a certain
Well, that's
way.
the opposite of dependent. So that's dependent on God because God has made it a
Our
certain way.
existence is dependent on God.
But our nature
And our
isn't?
nature is dependent on God, but it's also we're dependent on God, but our nature is what God has made it to be. Of course, we're dependent on God, but hurting my arm is dependent on the way God has made me.
Right. So if it's dependent on God, then there
Our
isn't a
nature
logical.
is, yeah.
Then there isn't a logical contradiction with Him determining our nature to suffer. So like it would only be a logical
Again,
contradiction if it's not dependent on God. It has to be independent of God for it to be like, oh, well, then He can't change it.
I didn't follow your last part. I don't see how God can. I'm saying God has made us to be what we are as a human being, and there are certain objective facts about our human nature that it's good to be X, Y, and Z. Like it's not good to have your arm cut off. It's good to eat food. That's good for you. And it's a bad thing to be hurt or to be harmed. And since torturing is a hurt and a harm, then the torture is going to be bad for you.
Well,
I don't
so
know
it's
how
like if something is true because God did it this way, then if God did it in a different way, the sentence "it's true because God did it this way" is still true. And so it doesn't matter what the action is anymore. So if you say,
what I'm saying is you can't take away the thing's nature in that discussion because God had made a certain thing to be what it is. Well, there are certain things that make a thing's goodness or evil be what they are. And if goodness is defined in a sense of attaining the teleology of that, what that thing is, then harming that nature, no matter what that thing is, God can't both will the goodness of a thing and not will the goodness of a thing. And you're saying that the torturing of the thing itself is a good. And I just don't, that to me seems like you're harming the thing. It would seem like a contradiction. I
Again, it
guess
seems like I don't understand why this is hard, because it seems very easy to say God created a thing with with particular nature. So he created the thing with the nature, and then he did the nature to the thing, and whatever it happens to be must be good by definition, no matter what the
Yeah, I'm not
particulars
saying
are.
whatever happens to be, because we have, so if my arm got cut off, to use the same example, that's not a good thing. I have the potential for it. But whatever happens to it, I'm never saying that's a good thing. It would be an evil to have damage done to your body as a human being.
Well, it seems like what makes it good is, did God make your nature that way? And if God made your nature differently, then that would differently be good by definition. And it doesn't seem like, in order for there to be false, to be logically contradictory, then whatever makes your nature good has to be independent of whatever God says. Because if God can just change it, then he can make you tortured.
I'm
And
not saying
that's,
God can change it. I'm saying that God didn't have to make us what we are, but he did. This is where the suppositional necessity comes into play. God
right.
didn't have to make us,
I'm
but
not
he made us
saying,
with a certain nature.
I'm
And
not
so
saying
whatever
change
that
it from this point I'm saying before he created us, he decided to make it differently. So if he made it differently to be tortured, then if he made our nature this way, and he decided to do that, then it seems like all of the logical necessities of your argument follow through in both cases, and you must call them good. I
okay.
can't.
Yeah, I'm just saying that a thing can't be both good and bad, and harm is bad. So then the nature, then doing the harm, doing the bad wouldn't be good. I mean, it's just by definition.
But it has to be good independent of God, or otherwise he can just change the
It's
definition.
accordance with the thing's nature. That's what I'm saying. Our existent nature is dependent on what God wills, but what he wills is a complete independent nature that can be done, things can be done good to it or bad to it. And I would think harm would always be a bad thing.
All right. Well, I think we've gone through that one for a while. Was a couple of questions from the chat, only two if you got time.
Just a couple minutes. I got to run in a minute, but yeah, we'll take a couple.
All right. Frank asked, I don't get it. Isn't God the standard of all good? That's the way he is presented in the Bible.
Yeah, that's, so I'm not denying that God is good. I'm saying God isn't a moral kind of being. He's called things like righteous and holy and all that kind of stuff, and that seems to be those kind of terms are used for God. We can say God is good. What I'm saying, he's not good like in the moral sense, because there's no standard above God, and God's not moral in the sense that humans are, because there's nothing that judges God's nature or actions. He's certainly good. I think in the metaphysical sense, he's righteous, he's holy, he's different from us, but he's not morally good. If by morally good means that you're judged by some kind of a standard like we are, I would just deny that God has any kind of standard to be judged by.
Gotcha. And the last question from Brian is, if we can't judge God, why can we judge Satan? Because if God is like outside of our realm of morality, it would be Satan is equally that's outside of it, and so it would be equally as inappropriate to apply morality to Satan.
Now, I think there's certain standards by which angels have to act, because the reason God isn't moral, because there is no standard, but God has made angels with a certain nature, and when they go against that nature or choose to from the biblical point of view, can debate what Satan did or didn't do that was evil, but it seemed like it was willing his own good over God, which is something that God has declared is wrong. So Satan, it's not because he's outside of time and space necessarily, it's because he's the kind of being that has or doesn't have standards or obligations, where I think God doesn't have obligations. I think Satan does.
Gotcha. All right, that's it for the questions. Thanks again for coming on. Really appreciate it. It was a great conversation. Do you want to give any links or references for people to find your work if they're interested?
My website's brianhuffling.com. I appreciate it. Yes, interesting in your take on morality and determinism. That's very. Do you have anything that we can look at?
Just my like YouTube stuff. That's it. I'm writing a book with the co-author right now. Hopefully it'll be out by the end of the year, but
oh, good. What's it going to be on?
It's debating morality from a Christian perspective versus an atheist perspective.
Okay. So you're writing with a Christian. I guess he's taking what kind of view? You don't want to spoil it.
Well, he's taking a more general perspective that he requires an authority to have some kind of moral obligation, and that God is the moral authority, and just disagree.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks for coming on. Really appreciate it, and hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.